House District in the Colorado House of Representatives. You met him earlier today. He has a very unique story that I alluded to in some of the work that he's done around this area. So without further ado, Representative Soper.
Thank you. It's great to be able to be with you today and be able to share a unique Colorado story. And it's a story that I hope that your states don't repeat. If there's one thing I can tell you, it's you don't want to be an outlier. But first, I'll tell you just briefly about myself and my background. I was first elected in 2018, which is a very important date. I'm currently co-chair of the CSG West Health and Human Services Committee. I've been on the Judiciary Committee since I started in the legislature. I have a background in law, having both an American law degree from the University of New Hampshire and a British law degree from the University of Edinburgh. I was born and raised in a small town called Delta, Colorado, and I did the obligatory political science degree. You can laugh at that. I'm also on our local hospital board as the chairman. 2018 is a key date. I'm running for the House of Representatives from a small town in Delta. In January of 2018, the FBI conducted an investigation into a funeral home in Montrose, Colorado, which is 30 miles from Delta. The owners did an interview with Reuters News Service in which they talked about how they were taking gold out of the teeth of some of the people that they were cremating. That led the FBI to not just have an investigation, but to want to see a little bit more on what was going on in this funeral home. So they arrested the two accused, Megan Hess and Shirley Koch, on suspicion of something bad was happening. They immediately had to release them, but they continued to conduct their investigation. What they found was something so horrific that even the investigators on the case quit the FBI. They had been selling bodies to foreign and domestic collectors, foreign militaries, all in the name of science. And then in return, they were giving the families pieces of concrete and cat litter and saying that was human remains. This was the largest body brokering case in American history, and this was in our backyard. My wife and I attended a memorial service for the victims in September of 2018. A bell would ring, family members would get up, and they would say what they knew from the FBI. One family member would say, I know that the ashes were tested because they took a bunch to Quantico, and that they weren't human remains, but that the human remains are part of an exhibit in Europe, or that my loved one is now in a private collection in the Middle East. And some of them got up and said, the FBI has absolutely no idea where my relative ended up. They just know that what was in the urn on my mantle is not my grandfather. I'll play this video.
After waiting 5 years, hundreds of families, victims of Sunset Mesa funeral directors, have some sense of closure.
The two operators of Sunset Mesa have been sentenced to federal prison for giving families cremated remains that were not the remains of their loved ones. Instead, selling bodies or body parts without their family's knowledge.
Danielle and David McCarthy spent more than 2 decades happily married.
So he had the classic widowmaker heart attack.
The veteran died on Father's Day in 2017.
My husband didn't feel any pain upon his death. It still doesn't stop the feeling that somebody murdered my dead husband.
A feeling she can't shake after working with Sunset Mesa funeral directors in Montrose, where she thought her husband was cremated. Then, the FBI called her after shutting down the funeral home that doubled as a body broker in 2018.
I was told that my husband had been dismembered and sold.
My husband died in August of 2015. I was going to have him cremated. She wanted to know if I wanted to donate his body, and I said absolutely not.
She is Megan Hess, one of the operators of Sunset Mesa. Hess was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to 1 count of mail fraud and aiding and abetting. Her mom, Shirley Koch, got 15 years on the same charges.
It was a silent scream of gratitude that this was finally over.
State Representative Matt Soper was in the courtroom.
I feel like it should have been a lot more than 20 years.
The plea agreement says from 2010 to 2018, the defendants stole the bodies or body parts of hundreds of victims.
Their body has ended up in a foreign country or was used as an experimental piece for a foreign military or for a collector, and that it was plastinized. And they said, we thought we were given their remains, and it turned out to be cat litter and concrete.
In 2020, Soper helped pass a bill that made abuse of a corpse a felony instead of a low-level misdemeanor. He says that couldn't be applied in the Sunset Mesa case retroactively.
We need better laws. We need to understand this entire death care industry. We also need to understand the entire body brokering industry.
Hoping for legislative changes.
And Representative Soper is looking toward the 2024 legislative session to start regulating morticians and have more certification requirements. Colorado is the only state that doesn't do it. The only requirements needed to fill out the paperwork and become a funeral director here, be at least 18 years old and not have a criminal record.
Shocking. By the way, I also own more than one jacket. What we learned from this particular case is that we needed to make abuse of a corpse a felony. That was the criminal side. But DORA, which is our Department of Regulatory Affairs, 5 times had gone into Sunset Mesa and 5 times had been told they didn't have the authority to conduct an investigation. So the next thing that we needed to do was to pass a law saying that a funeral home owner could not turn away a state inspector, because at that time we did, I guess you could say, regulate the funeral business entity, but all you had to do was file a 1-page form that said you're over the age of 18 and didn't have a criminal record. That was in place, and we knew that we wanted to move towards licensure. Colorado had licensure for funeral directors up until 1983. And that's when the legislature couldn't agree during a sunset review, and all of a sudden, licensure went away. In the course of the 41 years that we were without licensure in Colorado, we had cases like this emerge. But we also had another case that happened days before a Sunrise report came out. And a Sunrise report was to recommend re-regulating the funeral industry. And I want to play this next video for you here.
The owners of a Southern Colorado funeral home have pled guilty to hundreds of charges of abuse of a corpse. John and Carrie Halford admitted in court today that they allowed nearly 190 bodies to decay in a room temperature building and gave grieving families dry concrete instead of their loved ones' ashes. John Halford faces 20 years in prison. His wife, Carrie, faces between 15 and 20. We've been covering this case for more than a year. Neighbors of the Return to Nature funeral home in Penrose reported a bad smell coming from the building and alerted authorities. Crews ended up demolishing the funeral home earlier this year. Today, the DA talked about the lasting impact for the families involved in this case.
It's just something that strikes at the very core of trust. And when you're going through life experiences of loved ones and having somebody violate that trust is something that they'll likely never recover from.
This story broke days before the Sunrise Review came out. And because of timing, we were able to quickly pivot, and working between legislators and DORA, actually make tweaks to the Sunrise report to address some of the issues that happened in the Return to Nature case. And the recommendation was that we re-regulate the funeral or death care industry within Colorado. And had this case not emerged when it did, they take place on 2 different sides of the state. Colorado's shaped like a rectangle. We have the Rocky Mountains down the middle. The Sunset Mesa case occurred on the west slope, which is more sparsely populated. Return to Nature occurs just outside of Colorado Springs on the I-25 corridor, which is a heavily populated area. The entire corridor has probably 4 to 5 million people if you add up the entire corridor, which meant this particular case was on the news every single night. Every single news outlet was covering this case right here. Even though it had 191 bodies concerned in this case, and it really was a financial situation, they didn't bury or cremate. In the return to nature, in my opinion, far more egregious because they were selling the bodies, and we're talking over 800. The difference for us as legislators and as regulators, you have a policy window that only briefly opens up. And with a story like this that had broke, we knew this was our time. So moving into the 2024 session in Colorado, we use this as an opportunity to try to correct what should never have happened. I just want to give you a brief deregulatory history of Colorado's funeral or death care industry. Going back all the way to 1913, as a state, we decided that regulating the death care industry was important. That's why we created a state board for embalmers to have an examination. We built on that in 1939 to further the regulation of funeral directors and embalmers, knowing that those are two areas that we were very much concerned about. We moved it over to just mortuary sciences in 1967. And it was the idea back then that the public doesn't get to see what's behind the curtain in a mortuary, and that the public is at their most vulnerable time. However, a mere 9 years later, a recommendation was made to eliminate the board. This was a wave across America in the late 70s of wanting to deregulate and wanting to have less regulation. And as a Republican, I can tell you, I like seeing less regulation. But there's a reason why we regulate certain industries and certain professions. And it's because of stories like this that I'm telling you today. In 1983, the legislature could not agree on a sunset review, and they abolished licensure for funeral homes within Colorado. So no one within the death care industry had any sort of a licensure to go through. In 2015, we did bring back the requirement that at least you had to be over the age of 18 and without a criminal record to file business paperwork to have a funeral home in Colorado. Nothing touched crematoriums, nothing touched embalming, nothing touched any of the other professionals within the death care industry. Starting in 2020, as you heard, we made abuse of a corpse a felony. It was already a felony if the purpose was to conceal evidence in a criminal case, but the legislature never considered what happens if you have a case like the ones that were just talked about, where the funeral director is acting on their own pretty nefariously, in my opinion, but it's not to cover up another crime. That is the crime. We did legalize natural organic reduction. I threw this in here because Washington was the first, we were the second in Colorado, but we also learned from what had happened within our state, and that's why we put very specific safeguards and criminal conduct within this particular bill. And that was all very fresh in the legislature's mind. The next year in 2022, we had to establish the fact that our regulators could go in and actually inspect a funeral home when a complaint had been made. That was a concern that a lot of constituents had, a lot of citizens. They were really upset at the state of Colorado. They said, how can we have a Department of Regulatory Affairs that can't actually go in and inspect anything? And so we actually had to give them the authority to do that, albeit this was a little bit touchy because they barely had any legal authority to regulate an entity in which all you had to do was file a piece of paper saying you were over the age of 18 and had no criminal background. Then came 2024. This was right after the two cases that you just heard the clips for. That's when a group of us said, enough is enough. The policy window is here, and we're going to actually do something. We are going to fulfill what our constituents continue to ask us, which is, why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you taking steps to prevent another horrific abuse of a corpse case or another horrific body brokering case like we've seen in Colorado? And these are just the two big ones. If you Google Colorado funeral homes and cases, you'll actually see at least 20 other high-profile cases, albeit they don't rise to this level. So we regulated non-transplant tissue banks. So that was caught up in the Sunset Mesa case, making sure that there's no ownership interest between a funeral home and a non-transplant tissue bank. The really big bill was Senate Bill 173 that required licensure for all of the professionals who work within the funeral space. Now, re-regulating an industry is really hard, given that anyone who had been licensed 41 years earlier would still be licensed. However, 41 years, that's at least a career. So there were only a few people left that had actually been licensed back in the 1980s. So we had to come up with a mechanism of how do you move hundreds of people who are unlicensed and unregulated to be licensed and regulated. I still remember the committee room to this day, or it was a conference room really, it was not a committee room, but a conference room. And we had our state regulators, we had the advocates. Those were ones that really became the spokespersons for the victims of Sunset Mesa and Return to Nature. We had the lobbyists who represented people like SCI, which is one of the nation's largest funeral home companies. Believe it or not, they're traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We had Forest Lawn represented by lobbyists, and a few other lobbyists represent some of the bigger, more independent funeral homes in the state. And then you had a couple of legislators. I took the lead on the bill, and I remember everyone was arguing. The cacophony was drowning out all thoughts, and I was called to go vote. And I remember turning to this group and I said, I want to see some sort of a compromise, because no one is dying to become a funeral director. And you can laugh at that. And after I said no one's dying to become a funeral director, I followed that up by saying, we have to respect the fact that we have the worst cases in America and some of the worst cases in the world, but we've also got to make sure that we're respectful of the industry as well. And having a background in law, I said, why not having some sort of a peer review process where the industry itself will actually peer review each other so that when they go to apply for a license, it's actually someone else in the industry who's vouching for someone else. Now, you could say the entire industry is, in on, whatever's going on as far as selling bodies. I don't believe that's the case at all. It meant that someone had to trust putting their license on the line to vouch for someone else's license. And that's the phase that we're currently in right now in Colorado. Well, guess what? There's a few people in Colorado who no funeral director is vouching for. And there's a good reason why. Just recently, the state did the first regular inspection. That was also within Senate Bill 173. The very first person the state inspector went in to see, it was a funeral home in Pueblo. And like a good Scooby-Doo episode, they've inspected everything. They've looked at the coolers to make sure they're the proper temperatures, looked to make sure that the business paperwork is in order, the right forms were all filled out. Then there's this door with a dresser in front of the door, and the state inspector said, what's behind that door? Funeral director's like, oh, you don't really want to look there, nothing to see there. Well, they said, let's just push the dresser out of the way and take a look. Well, behind door number 1 were 20 bodies that were in various states of decay. Very much the same issue. Probably here it was financial. Instead of actually doing the work, it was easier to push a body into a back closet than to actually cremate or bury, and then they could pocket those funds along with any client funds as well. Horrible, horrible stories. I don't tell you these stories to make you have nightmares at night. I tell you these stories because as a room filled of regulators and representing boards, representing states and government, there's a duty to protect consumers. And I want everyone in this room to think about the balance that we have to go through. As we're considering, like in Colorado, the funeral industry, we had to ask the questions, what's the issue? Well, obviously selling bodies is a pretty bad issue. Lying to consumers, families is a horrific issue. But who are we protecting? We're protecting the general public, who in this particular case and in most regulated professions can't see behind that curtain. They don't know what goes on in the back room. I mean, if this was the restaurant industry, we presume that the cooks and everyone back in the kitchen has done everything ethically, above board. They cook the meat at the proper temperature. When we're sitting dining, we should never, as the general public, have to think about the fact that, well, what if I could get salmonella? What if I could get another disease from a chef cutting themselves and they transfer disease to me? We don't really think about the fact that have they washed their hands? Have they done different health protocols that we have accepted as being the norm? Now, regulation doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. I mean, we passed an entire regulatory regime in Colorado, and the very first person who was inspected, who, by the way, John Halford, who was the person in Pueblo who was just recently arrested, he's the one who had the 20 bodies behind door number 1, he testified on Senate Bill 173. He came to the state capitol and he said, licensure is needed. He said regulation is needed. And on record, he said, regulatory inspections are needed. And yet this was the same person who was the very first person to be inspected by the state, was arrested for committing a crime, and the crime was abuse of a corpse. Looking at the history is important. Knowing how we got to where we did, I appreciate the fact that there was another generation who said, we think the funeral industry is a bit overregulated, or maybe it's this place where we don't need to regulate it anymore because we'd like to scale back. We'd like to not have so many boards out there. I heard earlier today a sense of, well, you just grow how much is under one board's authority is the other way to do things. What I want to point out is that whatever is done, we need to be mindful of who we're protecting and that making sure the framework stays in place. Because in Colorado's history, we completely dropped the framework. Everything that we had was completely dismantled and torn apart. And so we had to really start from scratch. I also like to ask, are there any laws on the books that actually do what we would like to have done that maybe aren't being enforced? And in the case of Colorado's funeral industry, we couldn't turn to any criminal laws to say that what Megan Hess and Shirley Koch at Sunset Mesa were doing was criminal. It wasn't abuse of a corpse because we hadn't made that a crime yet. The only reason why they were arrested by the FBI and prosecuted by the Department of Justice in a federal court, which, by the way, being prosecuted and sentenced in a federal court is really hard to do for a crime, was because they forgot to check the box on the form at the post office that said what they were shipping to the Middle East was hazardous material, and one of the boxes started draining human bodily fluids. That's the only reason why the two of them were convicted in a federal court, was that they had forgotten to check this is a hazardous material. And so we had to make sure that at least at the state level we had the tools in place. And then you fast forward to the second video I showed you. We had someone who's now in the middle of a court case facing 191 counts of abuse of a corpse. So we didn't have the protection, we moved that into place. And then are we protecting for protectionist sake? Looking at this as a case study, and hopefully you can apply what I'm telling you today to, hopefully it's not bad in PT land, but as you're talking to your peers, yes, I'm sure some funeral directors would like to block out competition. But when we talk to funeral directors in Colorado, by and large, the vast majority will tell me, Matt, regulation should have never gone away. That's what actually kept out the bad apples. We were the last state to regulate the death care industry, or re-regulate, depending on how you want to look at it. That meant that all the bad actors in all the other states, those that lost their license to practice as a mortician, guess what state they came to? Colorado. The Halfords, who were the return to nature individuals, they had lost their license in another state, and they came to Colorado. So they're a perfect example of, you don't want to be the last state to do anything. You don't want to be the last state to regulate, but you should also ask yourselves, if you are that extreme outlier, is that really a good thing? And it could be that you just haven't discovered the major cases yet. I should go back to one thing, and I'm going to try this fancy thing here. Step number 4 at the bottom. Would it have prevented the activity? I know a number of people said to me, Matt, just because you're licensed, why wouldn't you still be unethical? And why wouldn't you still sell bodies? That's a really good question. Some probably would. But what comes with licensure is an annual inspection. And as we saw in the Pueblo case, that very first case, I mean, this person still held the bodies on site. I mean, it's not like they had been moved elsewhere, and he knew the exact day of when the inspection was coming. They were just so emboldened. And had we not had a regulatory framework in place and criminal laws to back it up, which is also important, then we would have not been in the position to say that we could try to stop future behavior like this. It's also a deterrent. I do hope that moving forward in the next number of years, no one in this room will ever hear a bad thing about Colorado's death care industry. That is my goal. Some other examples I did briefly talk about earlier today on the panel, so I won't necessarily go into great details. But all 3 of these were some issues I had worked on in Colorado that can compare a little bit to what we did as far as licensure of the death care industry. So we had the optometry sunset where we allowed optometrists to practice to the full scope. That was a classic debate on, what is the full scope of your license? But we weren't changing whether they were licensed. We weren't doing away with the regulation. It was just tweaking what extent is out there. We have the Digital Token Act where we actually repealed a regulatory framework. We once again were the only state in the nation to have such a regulatory framework. You should always ask yourself, if you're only 1 of 50, is that a good thing? We decided that was not a good thing, so we repealed that. And that's where evaluating, if you are 1 out of 50 and you have some regulatory framework, perhaps it is a good thing to repeal it. If every other state, for example, has an optometry profession being licensed, it's one thing to tweak it. It's another thing if you start talking deregulation and repeal. That's completely different. And then testing accommodations was one that we worked on also last year. And it concerns ADA accommodations for professional exams. What we had seen in Colorado is that there were barriers to entry. And every profession will say that there's a number of barriers to entry, and some things that you can easily see and some things that you can't easily see. So we have the Colorado Department of Transportation, and they have exams for things like being a flagger. Well, on these exams, they were not giving any accommodations for individuals who were dyslexic. And so what that meant was we were pushing different trades within Colorado prisons to try to have as far as a reentry program. But what we know is that a disproportionate number of inmates happen to be dyslexic. The general population, it's somewhere between 15 and 20%. In prisons within Colorado, it's between 40 and 50% are dyslexic. Well, as you're pushing a reentry program and they're not being granted a testing accommodation for a known disability that is recognized by the ADA, there were a large number that were not even able to pass what you and I might say is a simple exam. And that's because they didn't have enough time to merely read the question. It had nothing to do with how smart they were. But this is just looking at barriers to entry and how we think about regulation in terms of the entire ecospace. And I say this as an interesting contrast, I know, to what I just talked to you about the death care industry, in that if you can also address a problem to getting more people within an industry, it doesn't mean you have to lower the bar. But it may mean that you have to step back and say, what's an issue that's preventing more people from, for example, taking or passing the exam? And it could be that people aren't, in this case, applying for a testing accommodation because they either didn't know that's a possibility or were never being granted that. Kind of in conclusion here, I want to give you sort of some general takeaways. I have been part of some of the largest re-regulation and regulation debates within recent Colorado history from 2018 till present. Most of those were in the death care space. In total, we passed over 7 bills concerning the funeral industry. But it is a balancing test that we weighed for each one of those bills, which is balancing the demonstration of competency and making sure we're protecting the public, along with seeing if we're just creating barriers. Like I said earlier, people aren't going into being funeral directors or morticians and groves. I mean, they're not dying to go into that space. So if we create a barrier that's too high, we're going to be in a world of hurt in Colorado. And it's not like if we drive business out of Colorado, it's not like other industries. It's something that has to be pretty local. But I do want to hit on, did all sides come to the table? One thing is we were debating how to re-regulate the funeral industry in Colorado. It was very, very important that all sides be present. And while the funeral industry knew that they had to, once again, see some sort of licensure and regulation framework again, we also had to balance that with the fact that I couldn't really tell a funeral owner. We've had horrific news stories. I can't always side with you. Your industry has abused your privilege. And we also have to show the general public that we're acting. And we can't show the general public that it's only a facade of acting. We actually have to show them that we're doing something meaningful. Oftentimes in a public policy debate, you'll have lobbyists who come into a room and they'll create a huge bill with legislators that does absolutely nothing. And that's kind of the point, is you figure it will make it a little bit harder for some people in the industry, but at the end of the day, it actually had no meaningful change. And that's mainly to not have more work, it's to block out competition. There's many issues as for why that's the case, but oftentimes when it comes to some of these larger bills, you'll see these big industries get into the back room and they'll make it very complex. And the complexity is where they thrive. Last point on the takeaway, and hopefully I've said this about 3 or 4 times up here. You should be very concerned if you're the only state to do something. So if you're the only state to regulate, you should be very concerned. But you should also be very concerned if you're the only state not to regulate. And I want to leave you with that message, that if there's one thing that everyone in this room should walk away from, I know you're over on the physical therapy side. Remember this as a case study. That if your state comes and they say, physical therapy, does it really need to be something that should be regulated, or should it be consolidated under more boards, or should we lower the bar for the demonstration of competency? There's a reason why we've put some things in place. And even if you agree to consolidation or a little bit of deregulation, always think about what could happen. and how difficult it could be to recreate a structure if everything goes away. I'm not saying you need to be the highest level of regulation in America, but I am saying that when the conversations do come for what it looks like to change the law, think about keeping something in place, because that was Colorado's challenge, was we had nothing in place to hang our hat on. And so everything had to be recreated from scratch. And there was nothing out there for law enforcement, for our regulators, for anyone to take to civil courts. We had nothing. And so we had to start from scratch all over again. And we had to do so at a time when we had the worst news stories that were appearing on everyone's TV channels. Thank you, and I hope you learned something. With that, I'd be happy to take a few questions.